you begin by telling the audience how you fell into or chose the wargaming career path. This is a huge question, but if you can think of maybe a pivotal moment where you were like, you know, I'm choosing wargaming. I'm going to become a wargame designer, or I'm actually identifying myself as such. Phil, do you want to start us off?
Okay. So I grew up playing war games. My father was a science fiction author, and my earliest memories was my brother and my dad playing Starship Troopers on our living room floor. And so I went into role-playing games. You name the role-playing game, I probably played it. And then miniatures and other board games. The key moment was when I had the opportunity to go to the Naval Postgraduate School, and I had to choose a course curriculum. And I was looking through the curriculum book, you know, back when they were like printed, and found that wargaming was one of the courses there. So I said, hey, I'm going to do this. Of course, what I didn't realize is I would have to relearn calculus and all that other nasty math stuff. But I endured that and did mostly modeling and simulation. That was my emphasis in my master's degree. And I kind of built all my models based on that premise, from basically from a harpoon style game design. But so that really kind of determined that I was going to go into the wargaming as an operations analyst. The first time that I got paid to design games, design and run games, was when I was at the Office of Net Assessment. Now, before that, I had done plenty of games. I remember my club, we put on like 50 games of villains and vigilantes, stuff like that, when I was a kid. But the time that I actually got paid real money was at the Office of Net Assessment.
Awesome, wonderful. Taylor, how about you? When did you start calling yourself a wargame designer?
Sorry about that. And sorry if you hear my 1-year-old in the background. So I graduated from Georgetown SSP in 2013 and was doing the job hunts, and saw an opening for a contractor position down in Quantico, supporting the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab Wargaming Division. I did not have a background in doing wargaming besides playing Risk every once in a while growing up. I didn't play very many tabletop games or anything else, and I didn't really know very much about the position. That role was primarily started out with scenario development, doing a lot of analytic work for like post-game reports, and slowly grew into doing game design. And it turned out to be a really good position to supplement my academic background. The thing with wargaming, particularly at the service level, it's a really good way to get up to speed with operating concepts, operational capabilities, planning methods, and so, which is typically harder to get a grip on from an academic setting. So I really enjoyed the kind of analytic problem framing aspect of it, and it proved to be very informative to me, and that's kind of kept me in the business for the past 6 odd years.
Wonderful. Awesome. That actually kind of goes into a lot of our other questions, speaking to the appeal of the analytic side, which we'll definitely touch on later. But Jeremy, how about you? How did you fall into wargaming?
Well, like a lot of the others, accidentally. I didn't know that wargaming was a career until I got to CNA. My first day at CNA, I was walking through the halls just getting introduced to a bunch of people, and I saw somebody with a board game on their desk, and I said, hey, you guys play board games here? And they turned back at me and said, no, we run and make board games here. It just so happens that that person was Peter Perla, who I didn't know at the time and have come to know very well since. So like I said, it was kind of accidentally. My history was, I played a lot of board games, played a lot of role-playing games, but I haven't played any war games specifically very much prior to starting at CNA. Took me a couple of years to move from the standard analytic track at CNA over to the wargaming track. I was out to Yuma, Arizona, as you mentioned before. So accidentally, and I started calling myself a wargamer as soon as I came back from Yuma and started on the wargaming team at CNA.
Awesome, wonderful. And Becca, tell us how you fell into wargaming and what that moment was for you, that pivotal turning point in your career.
Sure. So my story is a little bit more similar to Taylor and Jeremy's in that I literally stumbled upon wargaming. It was my second day at RAND, and a bunch of guys showed up in my office and said, "Hey, we understand that you're new, you're looking for work, you can talk to people. Have you ever heard of wargaming?" Which I hadn't. And over time, it just became more and more of the work that I did and something I became more imbued in. The pivotal moment where I actually started calling myself a wargamer, I would probably say happened fairly late in my wargaming career. After I had been part of running, probably over 15 games, I still wouldn't quite say that I was a wargamer. It probably happened for me after I had designed and run my first game, from start to finish. And that was probably the moment where I was like, okay, I'm actually a wargamer. I'm not just sort of making this up as I go along. So yeah, that's my story.
Awesome. Well, and that kind of has me thinking, if it's sort of a progression where later you realize, oh, maybe I'm a wargamer, when you either, like Jeremy said, you join a team officially, or maybe it happens when you've actually completed a game. It seems like it takes experience and years of experience at that to really become a wargame designer. But for our audience, would you say there are any academic experiences or previous work experiences that really helped you be a better wargamer when you finally started calling yourself that? Phil, do you want to start us off with that, if you have any thoughts?
The key is to play a lot of games and a lot of different types and styles of games. If you read through Dunnigan's book, he says, play a lot of games and then steal the techniques from them. But for you to steal the techniques, you have to have seen them. So when you were asked earlier about, what would you do if you want to get into this, is play a lot of games and a lot of different types of games, role-playing games, miniature games, board games, etc. And of course, professional games. The other part of it is apprentice yourself to a master game designer. And my definition of a master game designer is someone who's been paid more than once to run a game from completion to end. And my bias, of course, is towards analytic games, because that's what I get paid for. And that kind of goes to one of your other questions of, you can't really get paid to be a wargame designer. Wargames is a tool in the toolbox of an operations analyst and other communities.
Great, thank you. Becca, do you have any thoughts on this question as well, on what experiences really served you well when you got to that point?
Yeah, so I think Phil's advice is helpful. I am not a hobby gamer. I didn't, come into this having played a lot of different games. I still don't play a lot of games, which, sometimes means that I'm not bonding with the rest of the wargaming community when they all get together to play board games at, bars, or at least when we used to prior to Corona. So I do find playing games and seeing games to be incredibly helpful to learning the lay of the land, and as Phil rightfully pointed out, actually understanding the difference between commercial games and analytic games, especially if this is something that you want to do professionally and get paid to do. But in terms of what experiences were most helpful, I actually think it comes down to subject matter knowledge. If you do not understand a concept very well, it's really difficult to represent it when you're designing a game, to actually demonstrate a different capability or a phenomena, and you need to be able to understand that. So having some of the academic background in order to be able to take something and break it into bite-sized pieces that's understandable, or to represent it effectively, very helpful. And also, depending on what you want to do within wargaming, I'm sure we'll probably touch on this later, but there tends to be a lot of different roles that people play within the field. Sometimes they're overlapping. I would say I am both a game designer, but also what people refer to as a game master, so someone who runs the game. there, I would say it's not so much an academic experience, but the fact that I'm a former theater kid, that helped me the most to be able to, command a room, to make people believe that the scenario that I'm telling them is believable, to make them be in that mindset where we're actually, no kidding, going to play in that potential future conflict and fight hard. So those are some of the skills and experiences that I found to be most useful to me as I've progressed in my wargaming career.
Thank you. That's awesome. How about you, Taylor? Do you agree with that? Do you find that you've got more experience to be a wargamer from your academic experience, your professional experience, from playing games, from understanding content? Which is it for you?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all the statements said so far. I think exposure to war games, particularly in a professional setting, is really important to getting up to speed. I don't think there's exactly a short track to that, particularly for professional gaming. I think you just need to see it, preferably from the beginning, where it's a very incomplete process, all the way through to kind of wrapping it up from an analytic point of view. I also think having subject matter expertise in an area is really important, but it's also, I mean, I've typically done games that shift in focus every year or more frequently, and so being able to also absorb new types of concepts, absorb new types of knowledge is really important. Being able to kind of speak to those audiences of folks that do have that expertise and kind of grasp it, because you're never going to be able to be an expert in any kind of particular game that you develop. From an academic point of view, I mean, Phil kind of pointed out that gaming is really an analytic tool, and I think that's a really important thing to understand. And in that frame of mind, just being able to develop a study plan, develop kind of an understanding of what are my objectives, what are some research questions that I need to get after, what's an approach to meeting them, and developing kind of an understanding of going from a question to an answer is really important. And in wargaming, it's usually complicated and involves a lot of uncertainty. It involves a lot of moving parts, but to kind of really break it down, for analytic gaming, it's about kind of exploring a problem space and trying to come up with some answers. So I think being able to be organized and to develop those sort of very coherent study plans from an academic setting is a really important skill to carry on into gaming.
Awesome, thank you. So that adds, another hat to the kind of image of a wargamer that you guys are presenting, both a researcher, an analyst, a creative person. There's a lot to it. Jeremy, you are really involved with the DC, professional wargaming community and running events that also involve just commercial gameplay. Can you speak to the same question of what experiences before you became a wargamer made you a better wargamer, academic, professional, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I want to say that I agree with everything that everybody said. I think all of these pieces fit together into something that's whole. And so without hitting on all of those, the academics, the experiences and things that, I want to key on one of the things that Becca said when she got into, how she got into wargaming. She said people came into a room and they said, you could talk to people, why don't you try wargaming? And talking to people is a really important piece of it. On top of that, the organization of people. And how do you get people to work together in the context of the war game to do the thing that the war game is designed to do? When I was in graduate school, I'm going to throw my geek card out there in full. I was part of a live action role-playing group. It was not one of the hit people in the head with the film weapons role-playing group. It was more of a everybody dresses up and pretends to be somebody else role-playing group. And I was involved with running that and trying to get 30 or 40 people to tell a story and understand what story is happening throughout the course of that, and to help develop the story as one of the people running that group. And understanding when you tell people something, what they actually do with that information was very difficult at first. And that skill really works well when you're standing in front of a bunch of people in uniform and trying to get them to organize around some principle.
Awesome, thank you. I mean, another hat, you know, if a wargamer is also understanding people and pretty much, would you say, almost like a human behaviorist of sorts, in order to be good at it. So with all of that in mind, I want to touch on something that Becca had mentioned in one of her responses about there being different roles within the wargamer sphere and different sort of types of wargamers. And I saw something in the group chat as well about, is there a pivotal point in your career where maybe you wanted to take this in more of a practitioner direction than a pure wargamer? But what does that mean? Are there different sort of roles within the wargaming sphere? Do they entail different relationships between players and practitioners? And do you feel that you have to pick? Whoever wants to start, maybe Becca, do you want to start on this one? Because you had touched on this point earlier.
Sure. So I actually think that you don't have to pick. I think that within wargaming, there are a lot of different avenues, but I think a lot of times it comes down to the types of games that you're running. You know, so I run operational games, but I also I would say I focus a lot more on strategy games and, you know, sort of strategic level gaming, whether that's something that's Paul Mill or otherwise. So within that, there's already some type of diversity in terms of what you want to do. There are different roles. You can design games, or you can just be someone who plays that, who runs them. I find that it's really difficult to run a game that you did not have a hand in designing. I've seen it done. It's just something that I think you don't have a full command of the topic as best you possibly can. But the other part that I heard in your question that wasn't quite fully there, but I'm going to talk about it anyways, which is it's really hard to just be a war gamer or to just be a game designer, particularly if you are a professional war gamer and you are an analyst at an FFRDC. You are a consultant at a consulting firm who you know, does government contract work. You are working at a think tank, whatever it is, it's really hard to just be a wargamer. So you always have to have some type of expertise or practitioner knowledge in another topic and do something more than just wargaming. And ultimately, those experiences are mutually reinforcing. They make you better at both sides of, you know, what your job might be, whether that is running and designing games or, you know, being a subject matter expert who could conceivably be a player in one of your games as well.
Thank you. Jeremy, do you have any thoughts to add to this, the different types of wargamers and whether you have to pick?
Mostly, I'll completely agree with everything that Becca said. I think picking is, I think if you pick, you're going to paint yourself into a corner. We have lots of different games that come in all the time. And if you want to come in and say, I'm going to only do poli-sci war games, well, you're going to find that you're going to have a lot of time that you're not going to have a poli-sci war game to do, and you're going to need to look for some other things. That diversity of career, that diversity of opinion, that diversity of perspective is really valuable from a war game. As I think Taylor said in one of his comments, the subject matter expertise and the breadth is really important for what you can bring to the table. You want to be fluent in a lot of things, and any of the games that you're going to do, you're probably not going to be a subject matter expert in that one thing, because there's probably not enough gaming to be doing in that one thing to keep you employed full time. So you're really going to be jumping from topic to topic to topic. So over specializing at this point in the wargaming, in the professional wargaming industry, is probably something that you can only do if you've got a lot of other experiences and a lot of other analyst work to back it up.
Awesome, thank you. Phil, do you have anything to add to this as well?
Well, I agree with the statements before about there are many roles to make a game work, and if you view wargaming like I do in terms of it's a collective story, then a lot of people, it's stone soup, and a lot of people do bring different perspectives to the problem. Now, there's a lot of elements of putting on a game that are, crucial roles, and that's kind of like the apprenticeship process that many people have experienced, where you work with a master game designer and he hands you a section of the game and you build that. But or you're we kind of have semi-professional players who play a lot of games, but because they understand wargaming and the topic for which they were brought into the game for, they add a lot of richness to the design of the game. I do wish to climb on one of my hobby horses with this opportunity to say, I have some serious problems with the portions of the wargaming community who play and run the same type of style of games, regardless of the question being asked or the state of knowledge of the problem. And most of them are stuck in seminar games that are probably best described as box sets. I have a real problem with them and shops that do that, because I don't think they advance the ball down the field. And as a former member in uniform, I don't think that serves that particular clientele well.
Thanks, Bill. And now I don't want to steal Taylor's chance to answer the same question. I don't want to throw us too far afield, but I'm seeing a lot of questions that tie right into this, because there's been a lot of interest in the chat thus far about understanding the lay of the land within wargaming. People asking, who are the clients you're working for? What are the different places to go to, maybe ones that aren't as obvious, like RAND and CNA? Where can I do professional wargaming? How do I land in a good place where I can do this? And now, to add to your point, Phil, how do they land somewhere where they avoid being in one of those shops where you're just seeing a lot of box sets? Those opportunities to do good professional gaming, and how do you walk into doing your first professional war game? I think that ties really well to the question of not only finding what kind of war gamer you are, what role you want to play, or as we've learned, you don't really want to pick one, and where do you do that? So Taylor, can you kind of start us off on that point?
Yeah, I'll try to kind of connect the dots a little bit. So I think to start off, to kind of frame this, I think it's important to understand the different roles that go into executing a war game, and the other panelists can kind of chime in if they think I'm missing something. But I think the way that I have typically run it, there's kind of an action officer that's mainly focused on kind of running the admin and the logistics and the participant coordination and a lot of the kind of the wedding planning side of the war game, event planning side of it. There's the design piece. There's the scenario development. There's the what I call CAP, collection, assessment, and production kind of lead, and then there's the facilitation roles, and you could have analysts as well. Those are probably kind of the broad type of archetypes. And I think to kind of connect to where we pivoted with this question, different sorts of organizations deal with those different roles very differently, depending on the types of games they're running, but also their capacity. So if you're running Title 10 games out of Newport Naval War College, you're going to have kind of like entire teams against each one of those different functional areas. Where I'm at, which is part of a relatively small analytic company that does not focus on gaming, supporting a client that is relatively small, that doesn't focus on gaming, I found myself doing all of these roles to execute a war game. And so kind of where you're executing games and what the organization is focused on can drive you to have to wear different sorts of hats. As far as kind of places to land, there is a pretty amazing diversity of gaming. On the professional side, all the services do gaming, all the command and commands do gaming. It's at various echelons. I think particularly since 2015, I believe, when Deputy Secretary of Defense Work put out a memo on reinvigorating wargaming. That one thing that led to was something called the Wargaming Incentive Fund, and it kind of became a little bit of a slush fund to run gaming, and that really stimulated, for better or worse, a lot of gaming within the department. But I think you've also seen this evolution in the private private sector for cyber-focused gaming and kind of crisis action planning type efforts. So it's a very diverse field right now, and hopefully that kind of answered the question.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. Just having the lay of the land, I'm sure, is helpful for our audience who are asking questions about that, and also understanding that there is so much variety and so much opportunity in the field. For the rest of our panelists, taking that really good foundation and then maybe building on that, can you speak to how that landscape is evolving? Are there going to continue to be future opportunities? And if there's anything else you want to add to Taylor's comments, that would be great too. Jeremy, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. I'll start by saying the problem is never going to go away. Whether people continue to use wargaming as a way to explore that problem is the big question, right? I think people have been saying for a while that the whiff, as Taylor mentioned, was there and invigorating, and then did we reach peak wargaming and are we on the downslope? But really, whether or not we've reached peak wargaming, there will always be a demand for good wargaming to answer the questions. And it's going to be impingent upon those of us who are in the professional wargaming community to explain how wargaming answers those questions and how wargaming is the best tool to do that. And once we stop explaining it properly, and once we stop underlining the importance of wargaming as a tool to that, then I think we run the risk of losing wargaming as a tool to do that and losing that important voice.
Yikes, losing wargaming. I'm sorry, Phil, did you have a comment?
Yeah, it's just in terms of, yes, folks are coming out to shut down the wargaming incentive funds, and they may have already done it. And Bob Work has left the building. So there's always the danger of the cyclic nature of wargaming. However, based off the efforts of the community, we have kept the nose up. And a lot of games are still going on, and some very good ones. The key danger is ourselves. You know, the enemy is ourselves, in terms of, if we don't continue to run quality games that are more than bog stats, if we fail, you know, if we fall into that category, then it'll evaporate again. But just as importantly, and I'm wish to commend this whole effort, regenerating the next generation of game designers to move in and expanding the community. And I think that is a great opportunity that folks have taken advantage of, and I'm very hopeful because of it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think it's really promising that we have, you know, well over 100 participants tonight who maybe are some of those future wargamers that are trying to find these on-ramps into this field. And again, thank you for being here and helping us kind of understand how we as young wargamers can do that and get into that life. So speaking to the future of wargaming, but with a bent at starting a career in it, I've seen a lot of questions about the tools that people should be gaining now or leveraging, whether that might be something like a Moore's certificate, is that valuable, or should it be certain kinds of analytic tools? Is it any tools that you have? What are some of the, I even had a question about, can a career be made using something like Command Modern Operations, matrix games? What are all the different tools? Is it good to be diverse, or is there one or two tools where you just have to be really good at this if you want to market yourself as a new wargamer? Becca, do you have any thoughts on that, or any thoughts on any of our previous questions?
Oh, so many thoughts, but we don't have all night, so I won't go into half of them. In terms of, you know, having one specific experience or having one certificate under your belt, I am a firm believer that you cannot learn how to wargame in the classroom alone. You can't learn to wargame just by reading about games, you know, about games, how historically have been run, how they've been used. You can't learn how to wargame by reading, you know, the design notes in commercial games. And I teach a class on gaming, and I want to help educate the next generation in a way that, frankly, I was not educated. But that doesn't mean that people are going to be able to come out of the classroom and fully understand how to run a professional game. But these are all tools that might help you get a foot in the door. And a lot of what I've seen in the chat, which I can't follow because everyone's typing really quickly, is, how do you get that first foot in the door? And so much of it is down to chance, but a lot of it is just demonstrating that you have the skill set to be able to do different aspects of wargaming. So this is what we were talking about before, about having the know-how to create a study plan, how to organize your thoughts, how to have a subject matter knowledge if you're doing an operational game, showing that you understand certain capabilities. Those are the things that will help you be more attractive for a job that you are applying for. All of that being said, I'm going to get on my hobby horse at the moment, which is there are a lot of barriers to creating the next generation of wargamers. And I think a lot of these barriers are ones that are very uncomfortable for all of us to look at. And we give a lot of lip service to wanting diversity in wargaming. We want diversity because different perspectives help us with game design. Different perspectives allow us to see new insights. Different perspectives can help us become, more innovative in some of the game designs that we're running, so that we move from just doing bog sats or the same old games into something that is new and improved and truly allows us to move the field forward. But we do ourselves a huge disservice because the field is pretty stagnant. And I'll be very frank, it is old, it is white, it is male. It's a sad state of affairs when I'm considered diverse. I am Caucasian, I am cisgender, I am hetero. There is no other community in the planet where I would be considered diverse. And so if I've already found that in my experience, it's been kind of hard to break into wargaming because of who I am, maybe my difference in educational background than some of my other cohort, you can imagine what those barriers are for someone who perhaps is younger, or someone who's a person of color, or just someone who has different experiences than I do. We need to address this if we are going to really create that next generation, and if we are truly, really, really, really trying to move the field forward. If not, what are we doing? So I'll get off my hobby horse now.
No, I think that's great. And if you were following the chat, like right as you were going into that, Rex Brennan had asked that question, and he was like, oh, she's answering it for me. And I think for young wargamers like myself and other people in the audience who are maybe tuning in, it's really encouraging to see that the problem's even been identified, and that maybe there is a lot of new energy that wants to break into the field. It's just about getting there. So I want to kind of talk about that too, the challenges and the limits, including, but also going beyond diversity. What challenges and limits are present in the wargaming field? What should people who are going into that field be aware of? What will they encounter that could be frustrating? Essentially, I'm asking, what are the worst parts of the job? And then maybe we'll follow that up with asking what the most rewarding part is. But Taylor, what are the challenges of wargaming?
So I totally agree with Becca's comments. I would add a few other aspects that are probably some that are a little bit idiosyncratic to wargaming and some that are not. So I think one important thing relates just to being a civilian that's trying to come into the defense space. If you don't have a clearance, it can be very, very challenging to get a second look and to try to get a job. That is just the national security space. That is true for all positions, and wargaming just happens to be one of them, where it can be a little bit less than competitive because you're trying to compete against people that have already kind of gone through that process. So that's just one. I think the other part is that it's a relatively small field, and I don't think it'll ever be a very large field. people are always shocked when I tell them that I develop war games for a living. And I think that is always going to constrain the kind of total capacity. I think it has grown a lot in the last couple of years, but I don't think that there's an infinite amount of kind of growth potential. I do think where there is growth potential, it might actually be in the non-VOD space, but I am less familiar with that. As far as some of the challenges with wargaming, I think that there's one thing that is, I kind of reference the wedding planning side of wargaming, which is, you know, I think one thing that is tough to appreciate if you're not a professional gamer, but games have failed when people run out of coffee. Like the logistics and admin side and dealing with participants and just the human element, which is both the strength and weakness of gaming, is really important to kind of understand. And I've often grappled with the kind of very abstract academic side of gaming, which I really enjoy, with the very kind of at times frustrating aspects of just trying to run a large event with a diverse group of people. So that is something to kind of keep in mind. I think there are some challenges with wargaming in terms of it's typically not a tool. It's best kind of, Peter Perlow would call this kind of the cycle of research, but it's best when it's part of a larger process. It's typically not the thing that's going to give you the final answer, and it's usually not the thing that's going to give you the first answer. So a lot of war games end up being, frankly, of limited value because they don't have a good kind of path towards following on, or they are not really focused on a kind of a problem that's worth answering. So trying to kind of work to position games to be fruitful and provide real value to the clients can be a really challenging process. And that's just something that we kind of have to deal with within the profession.
Awesome. Thank you. And I like that you were able to sort of tie in the cycle of research as something that can be both challenging, but also makes games the best when it's done correctly. Jeremy, do you have any further thoughts on challenges in wargaming, and also if you have any solutions you want to offer to any of those that you identify?
So there are a lot of mundane frustrations to wargaming. They're the day-to-day things, individual sponsor communications or challenges in game designs, or data not being available to answer the questions that you're trying to hit. But I think the most pervasive problem that I've come into is explaining how you can use the results of wargames. Because that problem is not only with your wargame sponsors, it's not only with your wargame players, but it's in anyone who might be consuming the results of your wargame research. So if you write a paper that describes something about a wargame and you limit the bounds of what you're trying to say, if you're not extremely careful on how you word it, the results can be taken out of context and used for more than what they're intended to be used for. So I think that's the biggest challenge, and the thing that I would advocate for is careful writing and careful analysis, and making sure that the people that are running and analyzing the war game really understand the difference between a player input and an assumption going into the game. Make sure that's clearly and articulately stated in the results, and make sure that people explain the limits of what a war game can and can't do.
You know, continuing on that, one of the first questions that was posted in the chat is, you know, it seems like a lot of war games are just about conflict, maybe because it's safe, maybe because that's what's desired. But Phil, I saw that you were chiming in and answering some of these concerns and in the chat as well. I wanted to know if you would comment on these challenges and limits to war games, but also maybe if you could think of an example of you know, what kind of questions are ungameable? Is there a concept that's ungameable, and how do you communicate that, to build on Jeremy's point? You know, how do you address those things that maybe war games aren't suited to address?
Well, wargaming is about human decision making under conditions of uncertainty. If the sponsor's asking you a question that's not about human decision making, wargaming is probably not the right tool. And this is why I go back to saying wargaming is one tool in my toolbox. I'm not going to be able to run a very good game from a game perspective about a surface-to-air missile engagement. Right? I do modeling simulation for that. Now the question is about human decision making, or if I'm doing plane versus plane, I can easily simulate that. But then I got to ask the questions of: is the pilot going to press ahead? Because there might be somebody got behind the guy who's going after, et cetera. Those kinds of decisions. On the other hand, I've done quite a few games in non-military environments, or where, more accurately, the M is the smallest part of the dime, and the E, the economic element, is the largest part, but it's in the hands of a lot of different organizations not controlled by governments. So that goes into issues of agency. And so, the key is, yes, there are lots of times games are run by charlatans for things that are not war games, which is why they become bog sats. The key is, in a game, you want to make sure there's competing sides, and that be a war conflict, it could be economic or something like that. Force the players to make decisions and then live with the consequences of those decisions. Those are the key elements of a war game. And if you don't have that, then you're selecting for the question. And this goes to another question that was asked earlier. What's the most important thing for a game designer to do? Sit down with the actual sponsor, the guy paying the bills, and find out what his questions are. That's the most important thing you can do as a game designer. Over.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful, and I like that you were able to connect a lot of dots there. That sometimes the issue with it is all the way back to the question that's trying to be answered. And I wanted to capitalize on something that you mentioned with wargaming just being one of your tools. I've seen a lot of questions in the chat about different tools and their relationship to wargaming or their application to wargaming, whether that might be, I wrote down software for supporting human-mediated war games, whether that's AI, how technology might be changing this space. There was also a question about modeling in Sims and its relation to wargaming, whether those things are compatible even. And did any of you have any thoughts on using other tools in conjunction with war games, or how tools that are emerging might be changing war games that would be relevant for our audience to know about? Jeremy, do you have any thoughts on that?
That is a tough question. And the short answer, well, there is no short answer to that question. The reason being, as Phil talked about, war games are about human decision making. Do you have any technological tools that aid or change or help you record or capture human decision making? At Connections last year, I saw there was a lot of discussion about Connections in the chat recently. At the 2019 Connections, Ed McGrady ran a panel on the future of wargaming, what wargame will look like in the future, and a bunch of us wrote some articles, some like kind of short story fantasy articles about what wargaming would look like in 20 years or so from now, or longer. And we envisioned some tools and fantastic situations that might help or change wargames. But I think a lot of the people that were writing for that said the fundamentals of wargaming are the same. Whether you're using augmented reality or virtual reality or computer systems or holodeck, you're still just trying to augment human decision making and to get into people's brains differently or better. So I think there are capturing advances that we can do, visual recording of things, automated transcriptions, things like that that are available now in some security environments. But we've got to also make sure that any of the technology we add doesn't detract from our ability to focus on the humans and the decisions of it.
Thank you, Jeremy. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Phil.
I would just like foot stomp on what he said, that don't try and force a war game into being a simulation and vice versa. They're two complementary tools, but they are not the same.
Hmm.
I think
Thank you. Oh yeah, go ahead, Taylor.
Yeah, I mean, along the lines of, there's kind of been a little bit of a push, particularly over the last few years, to integrate more kind of visualization tools and more kind of methods to improve kind of like interaction and even like quick turn adjudication, and there's certainly some value in those things. I think sometimes they can become a distraction. They can become, they kind of remove your focus on that human decision making, as Phil articulated. I think one of the challenges that I think the community has to deal with over the next few years is there's increasingly, I see tools are being described as being both M&S tools and wargaming tools, and they usually require very different sort of requirements. You're going to interact with them very differently. But there seems to be a drive on the sponsor side to see more of those things, because it provides, or at least it creates an impression of more rigorous kind of assessment being part of your game. And in some cases that might be true, but in other cases it ends up distracting you from the central problem and the central focus.
Awesome. Thank you. Becca, I saw you nodding your head a lot to a lot of the things that were being said. And I'm curious about your thoughts on what's making you nod your head, but also curious if you think maybe with the progression of technology, if maybe we'll see that maybe this is an open door to diversify the field, bringing people in who can kind of help the wargaming field answer those questions. Any thoughts you have?
Yeah, so I think this actually links back to something that we were talking about earlier about whether, wargaming was going to be a growing field that one could have a career in for a long time. And, I think you've heard a lot of people on the panel saying that there tends to historically be this boom bust cycle of wargaming, where sometimes it's on the up and sometimes it's on the downturn. When it's on the downturn, it's historically been that modeling and sim or computer-based simulations of various sorts tend to become more popular. I posit that, we kind of had our uptick, around the time of Bob Work's memo. And I think we're on a slow downturn. Doesn't mean that wargaming's going away. It just means that perhaps some of the bad habits that we're coming across, not only from game designers about, frauding about what's a good game versus a bad game, what could be a game, what shouldn't be a game, but also of sponsors of games just saying, hi, I've got money that's going to burn on the lawn. If I don't use it, it's gonna burn, so I might as well just have a game because that's the new in thing to do. So when we potentially are at this downturn, we have an opportunity as a field to not only add in new people, but to innovate. And this is when we can potentially bring in different tools, whether that's trying to layer traditional avenues on top of each other. So incorporating more of modeling and simulation into more of your board games and structured games, whether that's trying to bring in people who have different experiences working with technology into some of the game design processes, just because perhaps they have a different pattern of thinking than members of the community. So all in all, I think everyone has mentioned some really, really good points, that hence why I'm nodding my head all of the time. But I think, what's coming is an opportunity. We just need to seize it correctly and not seize it in the wrong way, so that we end up doing the field a bit of a disservice. And then just one point of clarification. We've talked a lot about BOGSATs. I've been guilty of saying the acronym, but not saying what it means in case we don't have just an expert audience here. So it's a bunch of guys or girls sitting around a table. And it's the pejorative term that you hear in wargaming that usually means that it's something that's more akin to a workshop. Because BOGSAT's used probably the most when we're talking about seminar games, which tend to be very talky games. There are ways in which you can do a seminar game right and where they have value, and oftentimes that's adding structure to them. So we talk about BOGSATs a lot when we're talking about more of these workshop games where these people show up and they talk about the one thing that they want to talk about, whether that's really what is the matter at hand. What we haven't quite thrown out is you can also have an operational war game that's pretty much a BOGSAT. it looks like a duck. So in this case, it looks like, you know, perhaps maybe your traditional hex and counter operational game. And it quacks like a duck because everyone's saying the right things and everything's an acronym. But at the end of the day, it's not a duck because one, there's no real adjudication going on. It just exists in some guy's head who's making it up. And two, there are no repercussions for any of the actions that get decided in the game. And to me, aside from the human element that, you know, everyone has talked about, but Phil really eloquently described before, if you don't have anything happen in response to the choices that you make in a game, it is not a game. It is a bog stat, it is a rock drill, it is something, but it's not a game.
And that's awesome. I'm sorry, and I'm glad you clarified BogStat because it didn't even occur to me to explain that. I think that's spot on and an important context, what actually makes a game. And on that point, you know, we've been talking kind of depressingly about, you know, is the field in decline and the challenges and the limits, but to kind of turn that on its head and talk about some more positive things, let's talk about good design. What does that look like? What are the rewarding parts of design? I'd like to know about your design process. I think that could be really valuable for people who are curious about starting to learn about how to design games. Taylor, do you have any thoughts on, can you share with us about good design and rewarding parts of the field?
Yeah, absolutely. So Phil mentioned this earlier, but I think the most important part of kind of a war game development process is the first job with the sponsor and really getting an understanding of what their focus is, what their intent is, what success looks like, who needs to be involved, and really kind of starting to frame the process. But the way that kind of I go about developing games, it starts with what I call the war game concept, but it's articulating kind of the problem. What is kind of the question that we have? What is causing us to kind of need to do this war game? Articulating a purpose. What is the war game kind of supposed to inform or drive? And then articulating a few kind of real tight objectives. These are essentially the things that you're going to be really oriented around and focus all of your kind of game design development around. From there, kind of develop research questions that kind of break the objectives into individual piece parts. And really, I think that this is an important thing to emphasize for wargaming is that a lot of folks are very focused on answering questions when wargamers are really focused on developing good questions. And I think it's kind of a very different mindset that I've almost seen in real time as people kind of transition from doing more traditional analytic work and then come into a wargaming field. I kind of have to pump the brakes and have them start framing questions rather than trying to answer everything themselves. And then from there, that really drives kind of your selection of methods in terms of kind of what type of game do I want this to be, whether it be seminar style, whether it be kind of a crisis action planning exercise, or whether it kind of is a measle-driven game, or it's going to leverage kind of particular types of tools, but you kind of develop your design methods really oriented towards addressing those research questions and pointed back at your objectives. Typically that involves doing a lot of kind of development work in terms of developing kind of the inputs that you'll then use at your main event. I think one thing that's a little bit different about my war games is that I do kind of future technology focused games. And the big focus I have is on bringing the operational community and the technology community together in a way that they can effectively communicate. If you sit down people from those communities kind of right off the bat, they typically have a hard time even kind of working in the same field. And so a lot of the game kind of design elements that I have to weave in is really on how to facilitate a conversation between these folks so that they can effectively work together to make decisions and make choices within a war game setting. And then, you know, following all the execution, you have all of the kind of analytic work, which is really kind of the most important part in terms of trying to answer the mail for your clients and actually kind of affect decisions.
Thank you, Taylor. Jeremy, do you have any thoughts to add? And can you, expand a little bit on your design process as well?
Yeah, so the first part of your question, which is what are the good parts of gaming? And the good parts of gaming is when you see it happen, when you see the game happen and it works the way you want it to work. That doesn't happen all the time. it doesn't. War games, you're always chasing after your own design to make them work right in the moment. But when it comes together and when you start seeing people doing the things they're supposed to do and they understand the game and they understand what it's going for, it's a great feeling. So it doesn't happen it doesn't happen with every game, but when it does, it's great. As for the game design process, I tend to call it programming with people. And I call it that because my background is in physics and astronomy. I did a lot of theoretical work. I spent most of grad school sitting in front of a computer writing computer code, trying to get a computer and math to do the things that I want it to do. So when I approach a problem with gaming, I have a very computer programming-esque mindset. So I think of the people in my game as abstract functions that I'm trying to figure out how to do something with. So I know that a surface warfare officer thinks a certain way, and I know somebody who knows about the red team and the green teams know certain things are going to act in some frame of that category, but I don't know the specifics about what they're going to do. So I'm trying to build a structure, a personal interaction structure, such that I can put information in and watch it flow between all of these different abstract elements, these abstract functions within my system, and watch the answer that comes out in the end and try to record that whole process. So I think of building a program with a bunch of people to get some output out in the backside. That's probably a little overly technical, and for those that aren't programmers, that may not be a useful analogy. But that's how it fits in my head.
Awesome, thank you. Phil, can we have some, a summary of your design process as well? I'd like having this survey from everyone. It's really interesting to see how everyone's brain works differently on this.
First thing to do is, again, go talk to the sponsor. Find out what his real questions are. Are they about human decision making? Then, now I wrote a Phalanx article a few years ago that went over this. Then you got to categorize your game and force the sponsor to choose one. Is this a game about gaining knowledge, conveying knowledge, or entertaining? Now, any good game is going to have some element of all of them, but choose one. And then, is it a structured or unstructured problem? The ones that I usually do, I'm being asked to create knowledge, and I'm starting with an unstructured problem, and I'm using the game to help me structure it. And so my father was an operations analyst, and he just beat it into my head that a good operations analyst takes the hypothesis in the mind of the commander, gets the context for it, and then analyzes it and brings it back. There are very few tools out there that can do that better than a war game. Plus, I have the advantage in the war game that I'm more than one commander, therefore more than one hypothesis, so I get what we call dialectic materialism. I have a clash between two hypotheses, thesis, antithesis, collision, synthesis, and then I use that as a hypothesis generation tool to go off and do my cycle of research. In terms of designing a game, put it into those bins, figure out where are we in the continuum of gaming, meaning how much rigor is there in the phenomenology I'm going to play in the game, how much agency is in the hands of the different actors within that space. And once I fully understand that, then I follow Dunnigan's advice and I go and steal from a previously successful game on that particular topic. But if you don't listen to the sponsor, you're going to have a problem. And you can't steal if you haven't ransacked the local museum, so to speak. Now, there's some places, particularly RAND, where they have a lot of experienced game designers out there. And so in some ways, the folks who are working there can go to the different artists there and borrow from their designs as well. But I just follow Dunnigan's advice, steal. But when you steal, make sure you're using the right methodology for what you're doing. What works in a commercial entertainment game may not be successful in an analytic game. So you got to be careful. And a lot of that comes from experience. And part of that experience is watching the grandmasters at work.
Well, and if I could just ask a really quick follow-up question to what you said, because there was a question in the chat that I think ties to this. There was a question about whether or not you in particular have mentioned that, you know, it has to be a good question, and you have to sit down with the sponsor and get to the root of that question. But there was a question in the chat. Do you see institutional bias and questions that are preordained, you know, or have preordained answers a lot? And then I think I would add to that, what part of your design process or what tools have you found useful in combating and trying to get that better question? Because that seems like a really difficult issue for young wargame designers.
Sorry. Yes, that is a real problem, that many sponsors have a preordained question, and this is one of the reasons why they go to shops that run the same type and style of game all the time, regardless of the question, because they know they'll be able to manipulate the situation to get the answer they want. Stephen Downes Martin has written many papers on this, and if you haven't read his materials, I strongly suggest you go read it. Rex Brynen's Pax Sims website is a great place to read that and other great works on the topic. And so, because I'm doing a cycle of research, and because when I design a game, I bring in a professional red players that will destroy the assumptions underlying those preordained outcomes, because I unchain red. And if you don't unchain red, you're not having a war game. I mean, or at least not the type of games that I run, in terms of the goal here is to discover the truth through dialectic process. If you chain red to the back of the room, you're not going to get that. Now, if you're running a training game, like the purpose of it is to train, you're trying to convey knowledge, okay, well then you run measles and things like that. It's a totally different perspective. But the key is, you know, understand that question. But if it's an analytic question, then you need to design the game so that red can play a Kobayashi Maru on those kinds of preordained outcomes. And you know, that sponsor may not invite you back, but there'll be other sponsors out there who respect what you've done.
Can I just jump in with pointing out that, yes, a bunch of us do strive to do better when we get faced with a preordained concept or a preordained question that the sponsor is asking us to develop a game around. But that's not necessarily always the case for those who game. I think sitting where I am at an FFRDC, I have quite a lot of latitude. I might be able to go into certain rooms and walk around, certain buildings, but at the end of the day, I'm a civilian and I'm outside certain chains of command. I don't have to listen to the sponsor to a certain degree because I don't work for them necessarily. I'm being contracted for something, which gives you a little bit more freedom. I think there's an unfortunate tendency that has historically been the case and continues to be the case. You find this with a lot of Title X games that are played within the Department of Defense. And you have them a lot when the Department of Defense is trying to create new concepts. And that's when, rather than coming with a preordained question, they come to you with a preordained answer. What they're looking for is a game that blesses a certain concept. And so they can say, oh, hey, Rand ran that game that said that this concept is the best one, and that's why we decided to go with it. Or CNA said, IDA said, whoever it might be, Booz Allen said. And that's a bit of a problem. And that happens a lot of times within the Department of Defense, within the services, and within some of their analytic capabilities as well, because all of the services also have analytic capabilities. And so I think that that's an important thing to point out, which is a bit of a riff on Phil's answer.
Thank you, Becca. And can you, first, I want your ideal design process too. I want to know about how you design games, in addition to that awesome advice about sort of like swerving from these pet projects that people want endorsed with Wargames. But can you also explain for the audience what Title 10 games are, just in case we're not sure about the lingo?
So ultimately, and I won't get into too much of it, but Title 10 versus Title 22 versus other titles, it's about the pot of money that it comes out of. But oftentimes these are DoD initiatives or service-based initiatives that just come from a certain pot of money, and therefore they are a little bit more institutionalized. Oftentimes when we're talking about Title 10 games, we're talking about really, really, really large, massive games. So we're talking where there are, 50 to hundreds of players. Sometimes the Title 10 games are part of various exercises as well. So that's kind of in a nutshell. And I'm sure there's a bunch of people who actually are service members on this or have worked at DoD who are shaking their heads and saying that I just bastardized that explanation, but it's sort of your quick and dirty one.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you. That's useful for the audience and for me.
Can I jump on a hobby horse on that for a minute?
Yeah, of course.
Becca's very right about these cast of thousands Title 10 games that I don't think are games at all because they lack all the key elements of decision making, an unchained red, etc. And they're some can be very useful as team building exercises, particularly when we invite allies to them. But they are not analytic exploratory tools. They serve other purposes. They're game-like events, but they're not games. And analytically, you could easily destroy them in terms of any conclusions that come out of them about whether a process worked or not would be completely invalidated by the fact that these people are thrown together at the last minute. They never trained together. They didn't read the material in advance. So how can you make any claims at all, particularly about these cast of thousands like situations? So I do think some of those large games serve purposes, but they're not analytic.
Thank you. I think that distinction between, having different uses or utilities for different types of games is pretty important for young wargamers to understand that not all games are.
Yeah, or game-like events. They're still valuable, but they're not games.
Right, or training exercises or simulations or seminars and the like. So I think just to take us in a little bit of a different direction, because I've seen a lot of interest in this, we've been talking a lot about tools and how a young wargamer can become one and what experiences they need to be a good wargamer. But I want to take us in the direction of resources that people can use to achieve that. There's been a lot of questions about, are there unclassified, completed professional games online that someone can use as an example to see what some of these games look like? I also got some questions submitted earlier about, if I were going to set myself up on a course of self-study, what combination of theoretical and practical resources would I look at to prepare myself? Academic resources, fun resources like Board Game Geek. I'm just kind of looking for your mental library that you would give people. And Phil, you were holding up a book there, so do you want to start us off?
Yeah, so the first book I would reach for is Perla's, and then Graham Longley Brown's Successful Professional Wargames, a Practitioner's Handbook. This is probably the most practical book to take you from beginning to finish of how to design a game and the different types and styles to employ. So those were the first two books that I would pick up. If I was going to pick up another book, it would be Dunnigan's Handbook on Wargaming. And then for extra credit, get yourself a copy of Zones of Control. Warning, there's a lot of shale in Zones of Control, but there's also some real gems. And I'll leave it to other people to dig through that mine to find them. But then after that, you got to play a lot of games. Mindfully. I think that's the key thing that Ed McGrady always said. Play a lot of games, but mindfully. The moment you become a game player is when you're playing a game and you say, we could really improve this by doing blank. that's the moment you become a game designer.
Can I jump in?
Awesome. Yes, go.
So in terms of materials that you can look at, so you will not, or you shouldn't, in my opinion, you shouldn't find a game report that tells you all about the game, possibly gives you the scenario, and then gives you the play-by-play of what players did every 5 seconds, who said what, who did what. If you have that, it is not a very good game report. Ultimately, what we try and do with analytic war games is, as you know, everyone's talked about, you know, the broader cycle of research, but you're trying to use them to either generate hypotheses, to sometimes, you know, bless certain processes that you're trying, or you're trying to see what gets generated out of them. And so then you take those and you apply different research methods to what you get to see if it works. So you're not going to find a game report that's going to tell you everything about design and then going to tell you exactly what happened. But there are some really good game design reports out there. So the first one that I'll point you to is my colleague Ellie Bartels designed a game that looks at security force assistance in the AFRICOM theater. And that's available on Brand's website. It's really good. It tells you a really interesting part of game design and how it is that they were able to marry taking different principles of security force assistance found in social science and gamify it. Quite selfishly, I'm going to point you to a report that myself and Stacy Pettyjohn did. So we designed, and this kind of gets back to the game design process question that I didn't get a chance to answer. So we designed a structured strategy game that looks at Russian gray zone tactics. And we first designed this when there wasn't really a good understanding of what those tactics were. In my opinion, there still isn't a very good understanding of what the gray zone is, but it was our attempt at using gaming to help break that concept into bite-sized pieces that we could all understand and see what was generated from those games. We actually designed a series of games because the first one was quite broad, the second one was a bit more narrow, until we felt as though we had a good handle on the topic and all of the components of it, in which we created a much more narrow structured game. So there are two reports. One is a game design report, and then the other is a report of insights, which we then used other research methods on. So I'll point you to those two as examples of game reports. Apologies that I probably don't know enough from other organizations, but those are just two that I've spent a lot of time on. And unfortunately, a lot of game design reports or game reports don't see the light of day because of who they are run for, whether that's classification or just the sponsor isn't comfortable with them being released in the public domain. In addition to the books that Phil mentioned, I'm actually a huge fan of looking at some of the older political science articles that have been written about gaming. And so this isn't going to work if you are trying to learn up about operational games. But if you want a better understanding of political military games, there's some great stuff from the 1950s that largely was coming out of MIT at the time that talks about sort of the basic first principles. There's also been a reinvigoration of gaming within political science more recently, where you see a lot more political scientists getting involved in trying to use games within their work and trying to make games a little bit less unwieldy, trying to add some more of the scientific structure to them. And some of that has produced really interesting work that's potentially worth reading. It's not going to be your, okay, this is how you war game, or going to really give you some of the basics, but it will help you have a better understanding of the broader application of how wargaming can be used and how strategy games can be used in different contexts as well.
Awesome, thank you. That's awesome. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer earlier more about your design process. So I think we got not only an idea for your design process, but a window into some actual fantastic design work that you've done. So thank you for that. Taylor, your favorite resources, theoretical, practical, and otherwise?
I'm not sure I could add very much to what's been said. I think that from the more theoretical side, with the books that Phil highlighted, along with some online resources such as Sims and Moore's is another one, the Military Operation Research Society, the annual Connections conferences, and then second, as a non-RAND person, there is a lot of good stuff on RAND. I think that everybody provided some really good inputs there, but I don't have it.
Awesome, thank you. Jeremy, your favorite resources, fun ones, useful ones, pragmatic ones, theoretical ones?
Yeah, I think everybody's hit some really good resources overall. Unfortunately, even those of us in the community don't often have a library of resources from everybody else in the community. I know I have some access to RAND games and SPA games and the like, but even in the community, we don't have an open sharing of all of these things. So the resources that I tend to go to are my board game bookshelf and my local game store. When we're doing some game design, professional development at CNA just the other day, and we picked Ticket to Ride. And we picked the rule book of Ticket to Ride off, and we just started tearing it apart. Not because it's a bad game, but just looking at the rules and looking at every single rule that's in that rule book. It's a very nice, very tight 4-page rule book that tells you everything about how to play the game. But if you take any one individual rule in that rule book, it's very well crafted, and you can say, why does that rule exist? What does it do? What does it not do? If I were to change that rule, if I were to draw more cards, if I were to draw fewer cards, if there were more hidden information, if there were less hidden information. And I think the self-study piece of the curriculum that I would suggest is taking any game that you can find, whether it's a professional game or a hobby game or a historical game, one of the older ones back from when wargaming was first popular, right? And start figuring out why the rules are designed the way they are. Sometimes they're arbitrary, but sometimes they have a really critical influence on how the players make the choices that they make. And if you can read some game rules and then project what you think the players would do because of that rule, and then postulate a change to that rule, and think about how the players' reactions would be different because of the change to that rule, looking at those deltas, I think you're going to go a real long way to your design process and really helping yourself understand how to build a game that solves the problem that you're looking at. Each of those rules then becomes a new tool in your tool belt for designing how these games are supposed to work.
Can I just chime in with one more source that I was remiss not to mention earlier? My colleague Ellie Bartels, who's brilliant and knows so much about wargaming, just published her dissertation. It's, once again, sorry, I swear I'm not shilling for RAND, but it's available on RAND's website. It is phenomenal. It is a great contribution to the literature. And it does break down some of the basics of wargaming and some of the gaming history in a really digestible way. I strongly advise everyone to go read it. It's long, so maybe just skim it, but it's a really great resource.
Thank you. Yes, it is a great dissertation. I also only skimmed it, but it's awesome, and everyone should look it up, as well as so many of these other books that just like, I know for me, and not to make this about me, but the first one that I looked at, even before I took Sebastian's Georgetown course on it, was Peter Perla's Art of Wargaming. Was reading it on the bus on my way to learning from commercial games is so fun. And it's great to hear about your favorite games and resources that people in our audience can draw on as well. So, I'm sorry, my dog in the background. So I wanted to talk too, I think, about, we've talked now sort of about the gray zone between professional games and commercial games. And I'm wondering about the distinctions between those. if there's a distinction between, I mean, designing them is going to be different, but to the extent that you can draw from commercial games, how do they differ from professional ones? Phil, do you have any thoughts on that?
Folks need to keep in mind the perspective that when you talk about wargaming, and particularly the money flowing into wargaming, the vast majority of money in wargaming is in the commercial realm. And the amount of money pouring into commercial online computer games is the scale of Hollywood. In fact, a couple of years it was greater than. Recently there's been a recent crash. The vast majority of wargaming within the Department of Defense is training. And then actually a small portion of it is analytic wargaming. And so so therefore the vast majority of methods and techniques of games is in the commercial realm or the homegrown games if you're a hobbyist. You run into someone, particularly if you play miniatures, there's a lot of homegrown game techniques out there and a long history of them. So that's kind of like if you're going to go to, why'd you rob the bank? Because that's where the money is. Where do you go to find these new techniques and designs or old ones? You go to the commercial realm. However, you do need to be careful that the technique you're choosing is appropriate for the question, particularly because if you're doing an analytic game, it's for a different purpose. And you need to be mindful as you go out and mine those techniques to make sure they're appropriate to the audience and the question and the understanding of the phenomenology that you are portraying in the game.
Thanks, Phil.
One last thing.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Don't throw everything in your game, right? Choose only the techniques and methods necessary to run the game for the question you're asking. If you throw too many in, it will collapse under its own weight.
Okay, I saw some smiles on that one. Becca, can you add on to what Phil has said and talk about the distinction between commercial games, professional, and to the extent that you can draw, sort of cross the line between them?
So I'm an outlier here. I don't play commercial games. Never really enjoyed them. Thank you, Taylor. Thank you for being with me in solidarity, at least. I've never really enjoyed them. I've never really taken the time to sit down and play them because when I have, I just don't find it enjoyable, which is probably meaning that a lot of people are angry with me right now, but it's okay. I'm outing myself. So I recognize that I perhaps don't have an understanding of some of the commercial games in the way that others do. I think commercial games are incredibly useful for game mechanics. I think, frankly, some of the most innovative game mechanics come from commercial games. From where I sit, because I do a lot of work that's a little bit more on the Paul Mill side, some of the coin games that Volko Runke has done, and Brian Train, I will open their rule books. I will take a look at their games. I won't play them, but I'll take a look at what they've done because that's a great way to, beg, borrow, and steal, which is what this community is based off of. However, I think that's about it. I know that it's good for socialization of the basics of games, that there's some type of movement and reaction. They're good for socializing gaming more broadly. I think that apart from using mechanics, I don't find commercial games to be incredibly useful in the professional wargaming sphere. And I'm coming from the standpoint of seeing a lot of people, and in some cases, people that I would kind of put in more of that what not to do BogSat category, trying to use commercial games in professional contexts. And I think that that's sort of a bridge too far because a commercial game is created for a very specific purpose. Ultimately, it's created to either reenact something, to be enjoyable for those who actually enjoy them, or to promote some type of educational learning. They're not meant to be an analytic tool. So watching sometimes people trying to use them in an analytic way it's not going to work. It's some of what we've been talking about when we've been talking about our game design process, which is you have a very specific question that you have to answer. You have to identify how you're going to answer that the right way. Taking something that's already been built off the shelf and trying to turn what's supposed to be something that is a game for entertainment into something that's supposed to be a game that's supposed to promote new hypotheses, new insights, it's a bit of a bridge too far, I think. So I'm a big believer in having some element of distance between commercial and professional gaming for that reason. I think there's a lot of good collaboration that can happen, and I think that there's a lot in which the two communities can learn from each other. But I do think that there needs to be a recognition of what commercial games are and are not, and they are not analytic tools.
Jeremy and Taylor, I'd like your thoughts to add on to this conversation too. I think it's super relevant for everyone in the audience to understand professional, commercial, and their relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I have a pretty similar kind of background in the, I don't do a lot of commercial gaming. Actually, I don't do any commercial gaming. So I would echo a lot of Becca's points. I would put one fine point as far as there is some diversity within professional gaming for things like that are for educational purposes. I know the Marine Corps has really gotten into doing gaming as part of command and staff. I think that those are probably more applicable in terms of pulling directly from commercial games, and those can be insightful in trying to approach a new topic or think about conflict dynamics or think about interpersonal dynamics. And I would expect that for some training-focused war games, there could be an easier bridge from the commercial world, but I completely agree as far as for analytic games. It is nice when players enjoy the game. It is not a requirement. And I've done games that have been a little brutal to participate in, but fully meet the game objectives, and the sponsor was very, very satisfied. And so that is, I think that key point of the purpose of the game really drives the methods and the choices you make. And that is something that professional wargamers have to deal with in a much different sort of way than commercial gamers. I would say that, and I think Becca articulated that really well.
Yeah, so as the person who is just advocating for the use of commercial games, I don't disagree with anything that Becca or Taylor said. I think that they are very, very different. The purpose of the design is entirely different. You're not playing a commercial game in order to get analytical results. I very much like commercial games, and I get the question, what's your favorite game to play? And honestly, my favorite game is the one that I haven't played yet, because I play these games because I want to find out how they work. I'm trying to figure out what they do, why they do it, why they make the players do things. And once I've gotten through enough of the rules that I can understand why the rules make the players do the things they do, I suddenly get less interested in the game. Whether it's an app on my phone, a computer game, or a board game, I'm really trying to dissect it and figure out what the levers the game has, what's the internal game economy on the players, and in terms of app games, on the developers, on the designers, what they're using and how they're trying to manipulate the players in order to make more money and get more in-app purchases and things like that. So I'm fascinated by those kind of pieces to a game, and I think all of those can be useful as pieces to bring into things that you're using for professional games. So as Becca said, they can be useful for mechanics, looking at a rule book and pulling out those mechanics. But you probably shouldn't have a professional game that looks too much like a commercial game, or a commercial game that looks too much like a professional game. There's always the rare exceptions, but the difference between the thing that you're putting together for an analytic or a professional gaming purpose and the thing that you're going to put on a shelf that people are going to have fun playing are very different. As Taylor said, sometimes players have fun when they play your games, but that's not the point. That's not the intent.
Thank you for that. I mean, I definitely think we could take away from that. You know, it's great if it is fun, but if it's an analytical game, I mean, it kind of gets back to what all of you, I think, have been reiterating about how the objective of the game is so important in order for the design to work, which is super valuable. I wanted to take this, this discussion of resources is great because it allows people to, in whatever stage they're at of knowledge in their pursuit of understanding wargaming as a field, it allows them to find things that are suited for what they're looking for, whether or not that's academic, theoretical, pragmatic. But I wondered if you guys could shed some insight for our audience as well on the community of wargame designers. We know that they're not particularly diverse, but if you have any insights on, what are the different sort of ways that people can get involved in the community? Moors and connections have been mentioned so far. And if you could talk about, is that community, is it all professional wargamers with military background? Do you have overlap with commercial designers? Do you find them all in the same room? And how can some of the people in the audience find themselves in these rooms with all of those people? Taylor, do you want to start us off?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I actually think this is a challenge that I don't have a great answer to. I think that you mentioned Moors and connections, and I think those are good resources. I think one of the challenges is that, like, I don't participate in very many war games. I don't see very many war games that I don't design myself, and I think that is limiting for me. I've actually probably never developed a game that I could have participated in. I'm not. I wouldn't be kind of the subject matter expert that I was looking for. And so I think there's an aspect of it can be difficult to engage the community. And I'm very interested in forums like this and others that can increase that interaction. I think DoD has tried to do that with the Wargaming Incentive Fund and the Wargaming Repository and a couple other sources, but I would say it's kind of in fits and starts. And so I think there's a lot of challenges with that, and partly just because it's a fairly small community, and it's not a community that necessarily is going to interact by design. I mean, if you're doing a planning conference, having a kind of a professional wargamer show up can almost be more problematic than helpful, because they'll start to kind of nitpick your design rather than kind of trying to address some of your learning demands for that event. So that can be a challenge.
Thank you. Any of our other panelists want to kind of jump on this? How can people sort of, get in contact with the community?
Well, I'm, again, a bit of an outlier. I'm a little bit more like Taylor, where I actually don't, I've been to connections a few times. I'm not sort of on the circuit where everyone knows everyone, and I don't have a lot of free time to, do meetups and coffees and whatnot. And so, which is why forums like these are super valuable, and I really appreciate them. Jeremy and I have done 2 of these in like the last week, so it's been a lot of bonding for us at least. But so I wrote something almost a year ago about wargaming, and that kind of opened up the floodgates to all of a sudden receiving a lot of emails from people who were part of the community who I had never had the opportunity to meet, people who wanted to be a part of the community, or people who even just wanted to know what wargaming was. And for me, that has been a really fun experience of getting to talk to a range of different people. So it's a bit of a non-answer, but I'll say, if you know of someone who does wargaming, just email us, cold call us, send us a note on LinkedIn. I don't have a lot of free time, but I purposely try and make time wherever I possibly can. I mean, Sawyer, that's how you and I met, right? To the extent that, yes, there are some diversity issues within the wargaming community, everyone's friendly, everyone tries. Reach out, everyone will try and help where they can. It doesn't mean that they'll tell you how to design a game or how to get a job, but to the extent in which we can be helpful to people in their careers or provide advice or just nerd out, which I mean, I love to do. I think it's fair to say we all kind of love to do. We're happy to do that. So I would just cold call people. Cold call me.
Phil and
In addition
Jeremy, yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jeremy.
In addition to those things, you had alluded to it a little bit ago, Sawyer. I've started very recently something that I've been calling the DC Professional Wargamers. So it's kind of this very informal Excel list that I have on my computer, and I emailed Becca after she wrote her article to say that was I think the first time she and I had ever connected, to say, hey, let's connect about this. And right now there's probably about 60 folks, and I've been trying to organize a couple of get-togethers over beers and board games at a local bar in the DC area. So if people are in the DC area, feel free to drop me an email. I'll put my email address in the chat, and we could try to add you to that. And it's an informal get-together of people. If you're not in the DC area, I recommend starting something like that. Trying to find the local professionals is not an easy thing. Connections is a great place. I'd also recommend going to PAXIMS, P-A-X-S-I-M-S. That was Rex Brynan, who was here earlier and active in the chats, runs that. And it's a great way to kind of connect with the wargaming community writ large.
So I learned a lot from my colleagues at the Moores and Connections conferences. I would not have fully grasped or understood the power of matrix games had I not been introduced to it by Tom Moat. And I would not have met Tom Moat but for the Connections Wargaming Conference and attending his games. And it also then became part of my continuum of gaming, where it became evident to me that if we want to move off top dead center of seminar games and move towards rigid Kriegspiel, et cetera, so that we can produce orders that officers in the field can actually execute, that step in between the seminar game and the free and rigid Kriegspiel was the matrix game. And that combination of policy, role-playing as an entity, not necessarily as an individual, that came to life when Tom Moat ran those games. And I would not have learned about that technique at its power had I not gone to that conference and experienced it. So to me, both the Moores Wargaming Community Practice, which is very active, and the Connections events have greatly enriched my professional abilities. And they're also my best friends, right? They're my friends, and we share a hobby. If I played poker and drank beer, I'd be hanging out. But this is this is essentially my form of poker. Or I can play progressive rummy with my wife, or I can go play games with my friends. By the way, I'm also learning techniques that I apply in my professional life.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you. And thank you. I know I keep saying thank you, but it's really great, just on behalf of the audience, since I'm the only one who gets to speak, who's kind of in the audience, to hear all of your insights and to learn about all of these things. And we're getting kind of near the end of our panel. We've got about 20 minutes left on the clock. So at this point, if you're sitting in the audience and I have missed your question in the rapidly flowing waterfall that is the chat, if you would just enter it again, and I will try to catch it in the last 20 minutes. I've kind of lumped a lot of questions together, but if you feel that I haven't, and we, the panel, haven't answered it, now would be the time to put it in there, and I'll try to look for it. But I also wanted to ask the panel, because this has been on my mind, in this crazy time of COVID-19, how does this change wargaming? Does it change wargaming? Is this a peak or a dip in the importance of wargaming going forward? I know this is a hypothetical, but if you have any insights on the changing landscape for wargaming as a result of coronavirus, that would be awesome. Jeremy, Taylor, and anyone at this point.
Well, I'm definitely facing. Go ahead, Taylor.
Go ahead, Phil.
I'm facing this challenge right now because I got to design a game in which I can't have more than 10 people in a room, and then other issues because it's for a government client, so they have certain challenges associated with that. No, this is a definite opportunity, and dinosaurs like me have to figure out how we're going to use these virtual techniques while retaining the human decision making in the game. So there are challenges out there, and I'm working with some young, very bright young people who are figuring out how to assist the game and the technology, and hard is authorized, and I got work to do.
Yeah, I'm in a similar boat. We just kicked off. I have a recurring game series that we run every year, and we just kicked off our fourth iteration of it, and it's going to be a major challenge this year to try to execute. I think even if you're doing an unclassified game, I think if you kind of watch and run and facilitate war games, you'll see a lot of creativity happen kind of inside conversations and almost in accidental methods when people aren't necessarily engaging the game itself, but kind of around the game. And when you're on kind of a Zoom call, there's an aspect of kind of virtual presence is real absence. You're not really engaged in the same sort of way. You can't communicate in the same sort of way. Within a DoD sphere, trying to do that in a professional or in a classified context makes it much harder. I think that there has been a little bit of a movement towards distributed gaming, and I think there are a few tools people can leverage for that. I think for smaller efforts, that can certainly kind of bridge the gap, but I think there's some things that I think you're still just going to really struggle to replace, and a lot of efforts are going to end up being delayed. When I've seen calendars of recent events, everything's getting pushed to the right. So I think a lot of people are almost throwing in the towel, but hopefully there'll be some innovation that can come out of it.
So in terms of the distributed wargaming, I want to point out that CNAS recently did a war game where they did it all via computer, so distributed wargaming. They tweeted about it. So, if people are interested, you might want to look that up. I think that there's some merit to it. I mean, I agree with Taylor that you end up losing a lot of the power of gaming, which you find in some of the interpersonal relationships and reactions to each other. That said, gaming in a distributed environment, if structured correctly, might actually give you more opportunities to actually get more of your potential inputs and metrics in terms of capturing all of the chats in a specific way. I also would posit that the one thing that a lot of people aren't thinking about is that perhaps maybe we as a community have a duty of care to push back all of our in-person games until all of this is over. And I say that because games, even when they're small, even when they're for just 10 to 6 people, and I know that a lot of it is driven by clients and sponsors and their needs and requirements, we don't always appreciate all that goes into it. And so from the people who are bringing in the catering, from the more junior staffers that are often doing the note-taking, we as a community have a duty of care to those individuals, not only just our players, and we need to be thinking about more than just the game itself, but also some of the knock-on effects to other people. The plus side on all of this is there's a potential for some of the frauds and charlatans in wargaming to potentially be pushed out. That being said, there's also an opportunity for some of the frauds and charlatans in wargaming to find the new way to wargame in a way that just isn't very good.
Jeremy, did you have any thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, mostly I'll foot stomp what Becca said. I think she hit all the important points there. When you were talking about designing what the future of war games can be, right? This is an opportunity now for some of us to step up and find that new way of doing it. I haven't found that magic bullet yet to find out how we can do the distributed wargaming without losing that interpersonal connection, and the ability to have people riff off of each other in such a organic way as when you have people in and around the room. So I'm hoping that we'll find that, and I'm hoping even more that this will end quickly but safely and healthfully, in a way that we don't end up compounding the problem later on down the line. But we similarly at CNA, most of our games are getting pushed to the right. First we were supposed to do a bunch in March, and then it became May, and then it became July, and now they're saying, how about we just push it off until August? And a small number of them are starting to ask the question about how we can do it online. But most of our sponsors recognize the value of the in-person component, and they really don't want to be losing that, and they're hesitant to move online just because of that.
Thank you, and hopefully we do find the solutions going forward. At this time in the panel, I'm just kind of going to go down the list from the questions that have been asked since I sort of really opened the floor. The first one here from Jordan is, how can wargaming be applied to other industries? Any thoughts on that, Taylor?
I mean, I think that there has been a bit of a history of wargaming in businesses, particularly for kind of crisis planning. So if there was an emergency of a sort, it's a good way of kind of going through standard procedures, and also kind of getting a team to practice how they would go about things. So I think from a training side, there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. Cyber wargaming has become a really big thing. I think it's of a very different character. It tends to be more about an exercise rather than necessarily about a war game, which would be about kind of evaluating a new capability or a new question. But I think there are a lot of opportunities there. I think it's fairly untapped, but I don't have a huge exposure to it.
Still, other applications to other industries that you've encountered?
Yes, one book that I strongly recommend is called The Sixth Sense. It's a book on scenario-based planning and describes how Shell Oil Company and other companies have employed scenario-based planning in how their companies operate. They just use a different language than we do in wargaming, but as you read it, it jumps right out at you. And this goes with books on structured analytic techniques. If you were to combine the two of them, Dr. Yuna Wang, who works at RAND, and I developed a process we called the Cassandra process, where we walk the clients through a series of structured discussions that assist us in building the game and using basically dramatic devices to explore who is what agent in the game, who has what, who wants what from, etc. But the key is using this structured analytic technique to build the game, which assists in decreasing or improving the use of time of your clients in your game design. So, two books would be The Sixth Sense and the books on structured analytic techniques. The combination of the two of them I have employed for games for non-government clients.
Thanks, Bill. Becca, how have you seen other industries, application wargaming to other industries, if you have, and what industries might those be?
Yeah, so I pretty much solely do wargaming for DoD clients, so I'm going to pass on this question. I know of a lot, but based on the timing and how much time we have left in the panel, it might be worth moving to another question.
Jeremy, do you have any thoughts on it too?
Just to say that it exists. At Connections, I met somebody who does wargaming for Ford Industries, right? So it exists and it's out there. Not necessarily the easiest thing to find, and they probably use different language, as Bill said.
We are unable to hear you.
Sorry, I was muted. Also, for the sake of time, I was going to combine two questions that I think are sort of related. For students in the audience, there's a question about, tailoring your resume to highlight wargaming skills, but also a question about being a wargaming apprentice and what that looks like and how to find sort of a wargaming master to take you under their wing. Is that something that happens, or do you just kind of have to get in the door and then sort of hope that people mentor you?
Really quickly, at CNA, we don't tend to hire wargamers. We tend to hire good analysts. We tend to hire people that are interested and capable of doing lots of things, that are going to be able to fit into the broad analytic agenda. They're going to be smart people that are bringing their own toolkit that can also do wargaming, because as we were talking about before, doing wargaming full time is not necessarily something that we have slots for everybody. There are very few people that can just do that
100%. Thank you.
I've typically found that there's a lot of kind of accidental wargamers. I think there might be a few examples on the panel. I think in terms of skill sets, what I've seen, people that are very empathetic and can kind of put themselves in somebody else's shoes and understand how they can approach a problem. And again, I've kind of emphasized being able to ask really good questions has been quite important. And so typically, I'm not looking for someone who has wargame kind of spilled all over their resume or has done. There is a lot of value in kind of, and there's certainly lots to learn from commercial gaming, but I'm not really looking for that skill set as much as people that can demonstrate an ability to understand, comprehend, and articulate complicated information, deal with unstructured problems, break things into component pieces, and really identify like what is the main thing that I need to focus on, and what are the things that I can abstract, and be able to kind of think very creatively about that. And that is that's a skill that can serve people in a lot of walks of life, but for wargaming, it's really critical.
Thank you. Becca, do you have any thoughts on resume and also, apprenticeship and what that looks like, maybe a RAND perspective also?
Sure. So Taylor is spot on. I don't need to say anything in addition to that because he said it much better than I ever could. But that's definitely, you're looking for people who are bright, who are smart, who really want to be involved. I'm of two minds about the apprenticeship model. It is how I came up. It's traditionally how most people in wargaming come up. But I do think that there's some trouble with it when you have people who are perhaps overtaxed and overwhelmed, and they can't take the mentorship element of that perhaps as seriously as you really need to if you're going to help build someone from the ground up. I also think that sometimes the apprenticeship model can be a little bit rough in terms of, you are at the whims of who your clients and your sponsors are. Sometimes you're not a good fit for some of the work that's being done, so it's hard to learn. Apprenticeship also sometimes could be a little bit more akin to indentured servitude. So, all of that to say, pick your mentors wisely. You'll find them. You just sometimes need to look, and you need to recognize that sometimes it's really important to be able to get a bite at the apple. But once you have that bite and you have more skills than you realize, you are allowed to say that it's a two-way street and you're looking for, you have something to provide, but they also need to provide something to you. Because I think too often people fall into the trap where they end up just doing a lot more of the administrative work that goes into wargaming, or not really advancing, assisting with adjudication, but not doing adjudication, creating the order of battle, but not giving the opportunity to perhaps learn how to write a scenario. So ultimately in wargaming, like all jobs in all industries, you have to find the right mentor. When you find it, don't let it go. Don't let them go. They'll help you. But also, once you reach a point where you are mid-career or you're calling yourself a wargamer, don't pull up the ladder behind you. Think about your experiences and think about ways in which you can mentor and you can actually help other people grow, because that's exactly what we need in this field, is to make sure that we're building a pipeline of talent in a really, really helpful and positive way so that we don't do ourselves any more disservice.
Phil, did you have anything to add towards these new encouraging words for new wargamers seeking mentors?
I think Becca spot on. For those of us who are in a position, we do need to help the next generation come up. For those who are in the next generation come up, wargaming is one tool in a large toolbox, and you need to demonstrate skills across those things. I think John Compton said it best, that a good wargamer is a generalist who can then apply the analytic techniques to the designs about human decision making. And so, demonstrate all those skills, and then show up. But as Becca said, get more than one mentor, so that you're not totally at the whim of one. And that's going to happen in any good organization. And I've been blessed to work in multiple organizations like that.
Thank you. With 2 minutes on the clock, I want to apologize to everyone who put a question into the chat that we didn't get to tonight. After this, panel ends, I will send a follow-up email to all of the panelists asking if you're comfortable with us passing on your contact info to people who are in the chat. I saw some requests for that, but I want to, check with everyone before we actually send out any of that contact info if you're interested in doing that, just to keep the community growing. But with the last few minutes here, I just wanted to say thank you again for being here on our panel and sharing all of your lovely insights. And I'd also like to leave us with just this one last question. What is the rewarding part of wargaming that keeps you in the field to this day? Bill, do you want to start us off?
It's the human connection. And this is coming from a complete geeky introvert that, would have had a difficult, the reason why I was playing Dungeons & Dragons, because I would have had a real problems just even asking someone to dance at school. But in the end, humans are made for connection, and the real reward of wargaming is the human connection. And then, just on top of that, I've just been blessed with being able to work with really, really bright folks who give me new perspective on things, and and then a lot of them became my best friends.
Taylor, your thoughts on this? What keeps you in the field?
Yeah, so the thing that I really enjoy about gaming is there's an element that kind of stays consistent as far as our kind of game development process and working through the design, and there's elements that are kind of always changing. But I've done games on artificial intelligence, on autonomy, on directed energy, on new operational concepts that the services are exploiting. One of the things with wargaming is you tend to get, not always, but you tend to get very bright, committed people from each organization that are earnest at trying to describe things for you, bring you up to speed, and kind of work with you, and being able to continually learn from those subject matter experts who are kind of at the cutting edge of their fields is really a valuable part of the job.
Becca, your thoughts? What keeps you in wargaming?
So it's definitely the people. Some of my colleagues have become some of my closest friends. I've talked a lot about the fact that I've got this merry band of other women wargamers, and we call ourselves the Dames of Wargames. You don't build those connections overnight, and so that's something, but also meeting a lot of people, whether that's at games or in forums like this, it's pretty great. The other thing that keeps me in is that aha moment. In almost every single game, there's going to be an aha moment where all of a sudden the lights go on. And sometimes this happens in the middle of a game where, some of the players realize what the real objective is and sort of what the learning part is, or, it comes after the game when you're talking about some of the trends and patterns that you saw across a game series, or in that game itself, and you see all of a sudden it just clicks. And it's a really empowering moment to see that something that you worked really hard on, you took a question, you developed it, you found a way to represent it in game form, you facilitated it, you brought these people together, and then to see how it works and how it can actually feed into what you're trying to actually achieve is just a great feeling. And, you know, that's something that, you know, I think keeps me and probably keeps a lot of other people in the field.
No pressure, Jeremy, but you have the last word on this. Why should people be wargamers, and what keeps you in the field?
I would say the two things. One is that every game is a challenge. Everything's new. It's always exciting. It's always something different, and it's always nice to have something different to do every time I pick up a new thing. And then every now and again, you get that game where you can actually produce something, and you can see the work that you've done actually influencing your sponsor and helping them to make a decision. When you can see that happen, it doesn't happen every game, but when it does, it's a great game.
All right. Thank you, everyone. On behalf of the Georgetown University Wargaming Society, really appreciate everyone coming out tonight. And thank you, special thanks to our panel for sharing all of your insights. You guys really are giants of the field, in my opinion. And it's just been great talking to you tonight. It's been a fantastic use of Wednesday evening. So thanks, everyone. Stay posted on the listserv for the Wargaming Society to take a look at our future events. And signing off.